From Washington to Warsaw, Paris to Ankara, Brussels, Berlin, Bucharest, and Belgrade. Through pandemics and political movements, cooperation and confrontation, digital divides, and defending democracy, the German Marshall Fund is at the pulse of transatlantic relations today, convening the experts and insights needed to navigate tomorrow's world.
Good morning and good afternoon to all of you who have tuned in. Thank you for joining us. My name is Suda David Wilb, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund, I'd like to welcome you to our third Transatlantic Tuesday of 2021. Transatlantic Tuesdays is a series of GMF that brings experts from both sides of the Atlantic together to talk about pertinent issues in the transatlantic partnership. We're really pleased to have a Transatlantic Tuesday today devoted to the topic of sanctions as a tool of foreign policy and coordination among allies. This is something that we are really pleased to bring to you today. It's a very timely discussion. And before I hand over to our able moderator, Markus, Ziener, who will also introduce our distinguished guest, Ambassador Dan Fried, I'd like to just run through a few housekeeping items. One is that if you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The questions will automatically queue up and Markus will get to them after having a brief conversation with Ambassador Fried for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll get to your Q&A. I'd also like to thank our Business Alliance Council for support of this program. Bayer, Deloitte, Google, and Weiser are just some of the members. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Markus Ziener, who is a professor of journalism at the University of Applied Sciences in Berlin, and he's also our incoming Helmut Schmidt Fellow at the German Marshall Fund. Hopefully he'll be there this fall once the pandemic is behind us. Markus, over to you, and enjoy today's discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Suda, for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone to this Transatlantic Tuesdays edition on the topic of sanctions. This really couldn't have come at a better time, since sanctions are currently an absolute hot button issue. And the more I'm happy to welcome an acknowledged expert in this field, Ambassador Daniel Fried. Dan served as US Ambassador to Poland from 1997 to 2000. He was Assistant Secretary for Europe and Eurasia and NSC Senior Director for the Presidents Clinton and Bush. He played a key role in designing and implementing American policy in Europe after the fall of the Soviet Union. And most of all, and what makes his participation in today's session so valuable, Dan was key in leading the West sanctions response to Moscow after the annexation of Crimea and the military intervention in eastern Ukraine in 2014. Dan is also a distinguished fellow at the Atlantic Council, and he is a visiting professor at Warsaw University in Poland. Dan, thank you very much for joining us. Dan, let's jump right to the heart of the matter. If we look at Russia and the way Alexei Navalny is treated, also his supporters are treated. If we look at China and the situation of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, if we look at the threats against Hong Kong, Taiwan, there are sanctions in place against both countries, against Russia and China, but then one wonders, what have we actually achieved? Do we see a change in behavior? And well, the final question, or the ultimate question actually is, how effective are those sanctions that are in place?
So I'll start with the historical parallel to answer your question. In the 1980s, the conventional wisdom was that US support for solidarity in Poland and the Reagan administration's pressure generally against the Soviet Union simply wouldn't work. And by any metrics of success, it didn't work. And from, let us say, 1983 to 1984, the policy was an obvious failure. And the answer to a question you just asked, about effectiveness would have been not very. And then starting in 1989, we were all geniuses and it all worked out. Timing is everything. And policies seldom bring fruit within the timeline that you have laid out in your memo to the President or the Secretary of State. You ask me how I know. So that's my general approach to this. Sanctions are a policy tool. They're not a magic wand. They can be useful when applied as part of a comprehensive strategy that makes sense. They cannot make up for a policy that is too impatient or too greedy. Okay? We were impatient. The Trump administration was impatient with North Korea, and it blew all of its sanctions leverage by this ridiculous, flimsy Singapore communique that Trump signed just to have a flashy event. We were greedy with Iran. That is, the sanctions succeeded under the Obama administration in getting Iran to sign up to the JCPOA, which was a limited agreement, which had its shortcomings, but nevertheless left us better off. But the Trump administration had a list of, 13 bad Iranian actions that they had to change. It was Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's list. They were all bad actions. He didn't make it up. But sanctions were not going to get Iran to do all of those things. We were greedy. Now, with respect to Russia, in 2014, Putin floated the idea of laying a claim to about 40% of Ukrainian territory. You may not remember it, but I do, and the Ukrainians certainly do. He floated this idea, and so did some of his nationalist supporters, based on Catherine the Great's conquests in the 18th century. The Kremlin pulled back from this extravagant and dangerous demand under the pressure of A, Ukrainian resistance, and B, US-led Western sanctions. US-led Western sanctions. So that's a big deal. Second thing the sanctions succeeded in doing with respect to Russia and Ukraine was to get Putin to agree to the flawed but nevertheless workable Minsk framework, which acknowledges that the Donbass is Ukrainian territory. He didn't make a claim to it the way he made a claim to South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent statelets. So that was another success. Now, sanctions have not obviously convinced Putin to get out of the Donbass or get out of Crimea. So I grant you, they've done two things well, reasonably well. They haven't done a third thing. But then the larger question is, what Russia policy are the sanctions intended to advance? Under Trump, can you tell me what the Trump administration policy was? I mean, I can tell you what Fiona Hill's approach was, and I generally agreed with it. But did Trump agree with his own national security staff? Probably not. So you're asking me whether sanctions were effective under Trump? Yeah, effective to do what? To advance whose policy? You see, I'm giving you a long answer because you've asked a perfectly reasonable question. And the answer, the short, but to be brief, to sum up, the answer is sanctions have had an impact on Russia, not as much as we would like. And the Biden administration challenge is to embed sanctions in an overall Western, not just US, Western policy toward Russia, which is sustainable and makes sense. I'll get off my soapbox.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that you're basically saying, well, it's not only about a change of behavior, it's also about what could have happened but did not because of sanctions. I mean, you could argue that probably cities like Kharkiv and Odessa might probably be in the hands of Russian-backed separatists if there wouldn't have been sanctions. But let me get to another more recent kind of event we had been witnessing. If you look at what happened between China and the European Union had adopted sanctions, rather mild sanctions, to be honest, against China because of the Uyghurs, the situation of the Uyghurs. And what did the Chinese do? They were retaliating with strong sanctions. Actually, they doubled down on the sanctions. And to me, it looks like the EU has pretty much miscalculated the Chinese answer. Probably they did not foresee how harsh Beijing is going to react, and they believed that they could get back to business after imposing some kind of mild mild sanctions. So is it coming down to the question of decisiveness and to make clear that sanctions have to be serious and, or rather not sanction at all?
China sanctions are a complicated issue because China's economy is huge. I doubt very much we're going to go very deep into major financial sanctions against the mainstream Chinese economy. However, it's hard to argue against the human rights-based sanctions, Hong Kong and Uyghurs. In sanctions, like in other policy, you have to mean it. Of course, the Chinese are going to try to intimidate Europe and double down and push back. And we have to be prepared to stand our ground. But this discussion was billed not just as sanctions, but as sanctions and other tools of economic statecraft, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's these other tools that I want to mention. The US and the EU have, and both officially, but also through organizations like the Atlantic Council where I work, and I suppose GMF as well, have talked about using our combined regulatory power to enforce and strengthen international rules to which China will have to respect, rather than let them continue to game the system. This is not sanctions. This is not rules directed against China, but it is strengthening the international system, international norms in detail to make sure that new technologies and IPR protection and other ways that China games and exploits the international system, which has given them so much, can be avoided. This is something that the Trump administration just was never going to do because they hated the European Union. I mean, just in principle. Mm-hmm. Good grief. You know, happily, that is not the subject of our discussion. But now the Biden administration is talking about working with Europe in precisely this area. That's the way to approach the Chinese challenge, or one of the ways, systemically, and not through sanctions, but through our combined regulatory power. I mean, I tell you, I worked closely with the European Commission when I was the chief negotiator of the sanctions, the Kremlin sanctions after Putin invaded Ukraine, and I really liked working with the European Commission. I know it's supposed to be this terrible bureaucracy, but frankly, I didn't find it that way at all. Mm-hmm. I found it really easy to work with. Mm-hmm. They have their own criteria. I get it, but I wasn't going in there trying to get everything trying to get my entire list. I needed to get enough. And I found that if you listen to them and work with them, it could be done. Mm-hmm. And I suspect with that same, with a flexible negotiating mandate, the US and the EU and the other G7 could come up with guidelines to high ground we command on regulatory issues to have the advantage and leave the Chinese faced with the choice of blowing up a system which has given them a lot or moderating their behavior. I know, easier said than done.
Dan, since you have been working closely with the European Union, the EU has been adopting a global human rights sanctions regime in December last year. And so this follows pretty much the pattern we've seen with the Magnitsky Act that was implemented in the US a couple of years earlier. I mean, from your perspective, does this work? Is this a workable way of applying such a regime? I mean, is it all the criticism? I mean, the Chinese are saying, well, this is Western hubris. This is basically an arrogance. You want to make your ideas universal. So what's your response to that?
Well, isn't respect for basic human rights universal? I mean, the Declaration of Human Rights, doesn't China have some obligation? I am tired of and have little use for the arguments that human rights are a Western or imperialist, act of superiority. concentration camps, crushing democracy. We should have more confidence in our own system, and we should not fall for that kind of cheap rhetorical pushback. Mm-hmm. Human rights are indeed universal, and we all are bound. The United States has its own challenges, our history of racism, and we are bound by common values. By the way, I commend on this subject well, that's a longer issue. I think that human rights sanctions can be implemented. Oh, look, I'll just say it. Frederick Douglass's famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," is famous, but very few people read the last several paragraphs where he appeals to international liberal opinion. Mm-hmm. And says that in a globalized world, he gives a speech in 1851, says a globalized world, my phrase, not his, but with the telegraph and the steam engine, mm-hmm. that a dark, strange, evil institution like slavery cannot stand in the light of day. Go read that speech and then tell me that support for human rights has no place. Frederick Douglass got it. He was appealing to a liberal spirit mm-hmm. in 1851.
Dan, that's very clear, and of course, I mean that's probably what we want. On the other hand, we know that those sanctions are applied very often very selectively. We just talked about China. I mean, you know that Germany, for instance, China is a huge market. Without China, sure. German economy would look much differently. I mean, so there's definitely some reluctance in play, actually, when it comes to China to be too harsh, because that's
sure. I get that, and I am not of the view that a proper China policy should attempt to, isolate China. That's not practical, but that's not what the Biden people are talking about. Mm-hmm. They're talking about getting China to play by the rules, which is why I mentioned the regulatory stuff. But human rights sanctions, there will always be charges of inconsistency. But in my business, 40 years a diplomat, you're trying to do the best you can, with the crooked timber of humanity, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Manuel Kant, yeah, he nailed it. The mm-hmm. crooked timber of humanity. And I derive from that the lesson that you can't look for perfection in human affairs. You look for good enough and the best you can do at the time. I think human rights sanctions are right, but that doesn't mean you don't work with China or attempt, a positive relationship where you can.
Yeah, I remember that you were also, I think, together with Alexander Vershbo, you were actually advocating to have a two-pronged approach, sanctions, but also keep the conversation going.
Correct.
This is what can work. But let me just ask another question when it comes to how to make sanctions effective. And before we come to one kind of final point, sometimes it happens that you have sanctions that actually is strengthening the regime that is sanctioned, because people feel that they are unjust, that they get punished, and in the end you end up with having basically the contrary to what you were supposed to. You're strengthening your regime instead of weakening it. How can we avoid that?
By not being stupid. Okay, so let's see. What's the stupidest sanctions regime I can think of? Well, probably Cuba. That is, it's unilateral by the US, and it is in place mainly for domestic US political purposes. It's not that I have sympathy for the dictatorship in Cuba. I have none. But it simply hasn't been effective. Other sanctions regimes can risk alienating people if their purposes are not clear. And I distinguish between sanctions that are focused on individual bad actors and sanctions that push the entire economy, and sanctions that go after pieces of the economy. Now, the Russia sanctions, I've heard the argument made that the sanctions strengthen Putin. I'm not sure that's the case. In fact, some economists at the Atlantic Council are producing a study where they're talking about the hit to the Russian economy over time. The sanctions hit the Russian economy because it is an unreformed economy. That's the problem. And I think being smart with sanctions, being selective is the way to go. Sorry about the noise, I'm outside and there's a...
Okay, Dan, I think you're on mute right now. No, unmuted. Okay, Dan, talking about stupid things. How wise is it? How helpful to sanction allies, or at least to threaten allies with sanctions? You know what I mean. I guess.
I thought we'd get to Nord Stream 2 sooner or later,
yeah,
and that's
what
what
I mean,
you mean, isn't it?
But Dan, allies are allies for a reason, because we share the same values. We share. We probably pursue the same goals, and in some areas you probably might need allies in the future. So how wise is that to do that?
Well, okay, I'll get to Nord Stream 2, but first, as a general rule, I don't like sanctioning allies, period. But if we see a West European company engaging in sanctions violations, we can warn it, but we're not going to give it a pass. So I think, if there were a German company violating the agreed US-EU sanctions on Crimea, we would take action. But Nord Stream 2 is a case where I have some sympathy for the points you just made. I am known as a hawk on Putin, but it may surprise you to know that I am not a big fan of trying to kill Nord Stream 2 with sanctions. I don't like Nord Stream 2. I think it's a dumb idea. I think the Poles and Ukrainians who criticize it are essentially right. It gives Putin potential leverage using gas and energy over Central and Eastern Europe that he doesn't deserve. So I don't like Nord Stream 2. It's a bad idea. But I think that using sanctions to kill it is very costly. Why is Nord Stream 2 a bad idea? Well, it's a bad idea because it allows Russia to ship gas directly to Germany, bypassing countries in between, and hurts the integrity of the internal EU gas market. If the integrity of that gas market could be maintained, even with Nord Stream 2, by making it impossible for Putin to squeeze the Poles or the Baltics, then Nord Stream 2 might be a bad idea, but its downside effects could be mitigated. So that I've actually come out in favor of exploring a way around this.
Exactly. I think you mentioned that recently in another talk, and you were talking about a door number 3. That
yes, exactly.
Besides of kind of Germany ramming through the whole thing, or then surrendering. So what could that door number 3 look like?
Well, in the paper that Dick Morningstar and Dan Stein and I wrote, we suggested doing more of things that the Poles and frankly the EU have already done. For instance, more gas interconnectors to bring gas seamlessly at full capacity from west to east, to Poland from Germany, even if it's Russian gas. Secondly, LNG terminals. They've started, but let's have more of it. Green energy alternatives to reduce overall, long-term and mid and long-term overall dependence on fossil fuels. And enforcement of the EU third energy package and applying it to Nord Stream 2. Why should Russia have a carve out of an EU policy? No, there may be ways to mitigate the damage. There may be other ideas. I mean, the Ukrainians are worried about losing the transit fees, but they are far better off, far less energy dependent on Russia than they were 15 years ago when Putin did turn off the gas. The Poles are super mad about Nord Stream 2. And as I said, I think they're basically right, but they've not been sitting on their hands. They've been putting in place pretty advanced energy independent strategy for gas. So I think it's worth exploring this and probably putting Nord Stream 2 on hold while we do so.
I mean,
That's what I would favor.
There is some indication of recent statements by Secretary of State Antony Blinken, and I think he gave an interview yesterday to CNN, actually, saying something along those lines, that there might be a way of finding a compromise.
I mean, Blinken, do you know, I'm going to interrupt you just to say, do you know what Tony Blinken wrote about when he was a graduate student? He wrote about the Reagan sanctions on the Soviet gas pipeline from the Soviet Union to Germany, and Reagan let that pipeline go through in exchange for German support on a common economic policy toward the Soviet Union. So, like, he knows about these kinds of deals.
Yeah. But by the way, that's our argument. That's the German argument all the time, to say, well, we did that already during the Soviet times, so why shouldn't we continue doing this?
Yeah, except that the Germans have to take seriously the strategic downsides and the strategic risks of Nord Stream 2. I mean, they got to listen to the Poles. I mean, can we just stipulate that Germans should be careful before they tell Poles to calm down about Russians? Like, come on, that there is a real strategic problem here. Germany is not the problem. Putin is the problem. And as an American, I know all about mistakes, right? I was in the Bush administration. I know about mistakes. I know sometimes you need your friends to help you get out of it. I think Nord Stream 2 is a mistake, but Germany is a friend and an ally.
Okay, just before we come to the questions that are already trickling in here from the audience, just a personal observation. What I saw with regard to Nord Stream 2, and I'm also not a huge fan of Nord Stream 2, but I've seen that once the US was actually telling us what to do or not to do, and then applying quite a hostile language, this kind of, we're back to this issue of solidarity. This helped actually getting more support for Nord Stream 2 than before.
The Trump administration, the Trump administration wanted to fight about Nord Stream 2, not because Trump cared about Putin's energy leverage, but because he wanted to fight with Angela Merkel. The whole point was the fight. It just drove me crazy, because we could have been working this out with the Poles, Ukrainians, Germans, and European Commission and the Balts. We should have been doing this instead of just screaming at the Germans. It's Trump.
Dan, I have a couple of questions here. So let me ask the question from the audience. What sanctions you see as really effective to influence present conditions of Alexei Navalny imprisonment? What US strategy should be implemented together with sanctions? When we all have seen the reports about his physical condition in that prison where he is. So what is your brief take on this one?
Two parts. One, we and the Americans and the Europeans, others, Canadians, UK, ought to identify the Russian individuals responsible for the oppression of Navalny and go after them on an individual basis. So that's one. Two, it is perfectly reasonable to start thinking about broader economic sanctions because of the poisoning of Navalny by a nerve agent. There is a limited but real number of additional economic financial sanctions we could take, and we have to decide as an alliance, is the Navalny case one where we want to use this? And then in long term, support for anti-corruption activists like Navalny in Russia. Long-term support for free Russian media, long-term support for investigative journalism. Navalny's video about Putin's extravagant palace, right? That they put out has an audience in Russia. People listen to this. If you want to help Navalny, help the best parts of his cause, which is the anti-corruption piece, where he says his argument is we Russians deserve to live better than that. If we agree, and I think we do, then we ought to support that kind of journalism, that kind of freedom in Russia to report on the corruption of the system. You want to get to Putin? That's how you do it. And then not just sanctions, you expose his wealth and the wealth of his cronies. You find that out. There are lots of ways to do it, not using secret sources, and you expose that. Mm-hmm. This is use tools of financial statecraft to dry up the corrupt flows of Russian money and expose them. That's not a sanction. That's exposing bad folks. And it's not government. Governments don't have to do it. It can be organizations like Bellingcat and other investigative journalism.
And I have another question here on Russia. It goes, shouldn't the effectiveness of sanctions need to be viewed in light of an administration's other actions? For example, Obama's sanctions didn't work against Russia because Obama constantly was underestimating the challenges posed by Putin's regime and exercising too much restraint elsewhere, such as with respect to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, intervention in Syria, and hacking Clinton's emails.
Look, full disclosure, I was involved in the sanctions response during the Obama administration. Mm-hmm. I don't think they were that soft. I think Obama deserves a lot of credit for, don't forget, Obama reversed 30 years of American military drawdown in Europe and sent an armored brigade, a US armored brigade to Poland. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's a big deal. We didn't do it in the Bush administration after the invasion of Georgia. And Obama led NATO to put in combat battalions into each of the Baltic states and an additional battalion into Poland. That's a big deal. Mm-hmm. That's not a weak response. That's a strong one. By the way, Germany, leads the battalion strength force in Lithuania. Mm-hmm. I mean, think about that in history. That's a pretty big deal that Poland and Lithuania welcome, German-led battalion because we're all part of a democratic alliance. And Obama led this.
I have another question here. Would you, regardless of the humanitarian charges, accept the US violations? It seems that to me that China gets away with it because they can. This is actually a very Western behavior. This doesn't make it good, but I do believe that one can't critique what one does oneself. So I understand that this is basically saying, well, we should kind of look at the mistakes we are doing and all the wrong things we are doing before criticizing others.
Well, you need to do both. So in World War II, the American army was an army of liberation. And yet we were still a segregated society and deeply racist. Does the fact that the United States was a segregated society and deeply racist mean that we had no right to criticize the Nazis in World War II or to liberate Europe? I mean, I'm putting the question in stark terms because I often hear that. We are an imperfect country. We are flawed. We make mistakes, a lot of them. But nevertheless, we have at our best stood for the right things. And we have been moving in the right direction. So I will defend our ability and our obligation to speak out in defense of human rights, acknowledging our own shortcomings.
Yeah, I mean, this has also to do with this whataboutism, that you kind of, you're pointing fingers in one direction and then actually the other one is pointing at you.
That's right.
And this is not getting us very far, I assume. I have another question, an interesting question here on Nordstrom II, basically saying, well, can't we use Nordstrom II as leverage against Russia? For example, by establishing a snapback mechanism that would stop the gas flows if Russia would, for instance, violate the gas agreement with Ukraine?
I certainly like the logic of that question. And I am a great believer in contingency sanctions. Like, for instance, if Russia violated its gas transit agreement with Ukraine, we ought to have on the shelf agreed multilateral steps that we would take, for example, increasing energy sanctions. You know, I'm making this up, but you know, making it more difficult to invest in the Russian energy sector overall, or prohibiting it altogether. We ought to work out our contingency sanctions. Let's figure out what makes sense, but the logic of the question I find right. That is, and we did this when I was working on sanctions. We made it clear that if the Russians resumed their military offensive in Ukraine, we would be prepared to take stronger steps. And there are ways you can send that message to the Russians in ways that they'll understand are serious. They'll understand that you're serious. So yeah.
Dan, there's another question with regard to whether there are plans to establish a coordinator in the State Department, and this is obviously something that's going to happen, and whether you have some reading on that issue.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Eddie Fishman and I wrote an article recently. The Atlantic Council published, outlining our recommendations for what that office should do. So go take a look at that, because Eddie Fishman worked closely with me on the Russia sanctions portfolio and other sanctions issues. Basically, that office should not attempt, the State Department Sanctions Office shouldn't attempt to replace or compete with OFAC at Treasury. No way, that's stupid. They should work with OFAC. They should work the diplomacy of sanctions, right? The negotiations, so we're all on the same page. And they should coordinate the State Department so that the Treasury people don't have to deal with every individual bureau at state. That's inside bureaucratic baseball. But, it used to drive OFAC crazy. They didn't know who to talk to. Everybody had a different opinion, and I came in and sort of pulled things together. I didn't set the policy, but I pulled it together, which is the point. That office should think about the larger application of sanctions, where it makes sense and where it doesn't. Were I in that office now, I would be saying, let's find another way than a sanctions war with Germany, which will benefit Vladimir Putin, and recognize that Nordstrom II is a bad idea. So let's try to work that out.
I have another question here coming in on Navalny, but in a different way. Can we use sanctions with regard to Navalny without rethinking our position to the Snowden case?
I would not go, I don't think that's applicable. I think that's whataboutism. Snowden, that he's not an investigative journalist. He had a security clearance. He violated it. He's rather a sad character in a way. I think we need to support. I gave my thoughts about how to support Navalny. I think that the German reaction was strong and merited. I think that we need to realize what Putin is, but we also need to remember that Putinism is not Russia's fate. Russia is perfectly capable of better politics than the ones it's generating now. There are some Russian experts who believe that Russia will never, ever, in principle even, be anything like, in anything significantly different from what it is. But I think that's wrong. I think that's wrong. I have more confidence in Russia. And it may be that if Putinism is seen as failing, the Russians may be interested in a more constructive role in the world and at home.
Dan, I have a question here that's related to a very current issue about Myanmar and what's happening there. The question is, US sanctions have not stopped the violent crackdown in Myanmar, And what could be a collective response look like to change something over there?
I was one of the people who argued for removing the sanctions once Aung San Suu Kyi and her movement negotiated a power sharing arrangement with the military. And there were critics who said, you can't do this, the military is bad news, and they will not respect this agreement. And those critics turned out to be right in the end. The question now is how much we should try to push and isolate the military, and how we can do that at the same time that we're trying to help Myanmar society. I would, if I were in my old job as sanctions coordinator, I would listen. I would ask Burmese experts to find out who the people were we should listen to, and I would listen to them. I would listen to the leaders of the democratic movement about what should be done. How much, the problem is always, how do you punish the regime without hurting the people? And that is something we have to consider. How do we go after the military-owned companies and support what is left of independent business? So it's not just a sanctions question, it's a question of sanctions placed within an overall policy toward Myanmar. And, it's a nasty one.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dan. There are more questions coming in, but I think our time is up, and I really appreciate your openness and your honesty in answering all those questions. And
no, I don't have to go by my State Department approved talking points. Not that I ever did.
Well, yeah. Let me, before we come to a close, let me just mention that we have another session coming up. That's the next Transatlantic Tuesday. It's on April the 13th at 5 p.m. It will feature a conversation between former GOP Congressman Will Hurd and Vice President and Director of GMF's Berlin office, Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff. And they will discuss the future of the Republican Party.
That sounds great.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're looking forward to hearing that. And yeah, on behalf of the GMF, German Marshall Fund, thank you very much again, Dan. Thank you again, the audience, for participating for this lively debate we had, and hope to see you again. Thank you, Dan. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Pleasure. Bye.